The Echo in His Eyes. Chapter 1. Those say grief is a journey, a winding path you walk alone. For me, that path began 15 years ago, on a bright summer afternoon, when my grandson, little 8-year-old Ethan, disappeared from the county fair. One moment, he was standing right beside me, clutching his bright red balloon and chattering about the Ferris wheel. The next, he was simply gone. Vanished into the milling crowds, swallowed by the joyous chaos of a perfect summer day turned into every grandparent's worst nightmare. My name is Martha. I'm 72 now. The years since Ethan disappeared have been a blur of pain, police investigations that led nowhere, and the slow, agonizing unraveling of my family. My daughter, Sarah, Ethan's mother, never recovered. The light went out of her eyes that day, and it never truly came back. She and her husband, my son-in-law Mark, drifted apart under the immense weight of their shared loss, the unspoken blame, the constant, gnawing what-ifs. They divorced a few years later, their family shattered like fragile glass. I tried to be strong for Sarah, but my own heart was broken into a million pieces. Ethan was my first grandchild, the one who had made me a grandmother, a role I cherished more than words could say. He was a bright, curious boy with a mop of sandy brown hair and eyes the color of a summer sky. He loved dinosaurs, drawing, and the sound of my old wind chimes on the porch. Every corner of my house held a memory of him. His drawings taped to the fridge, a small plastic dinosaur left on a bookshelf, the faded stain on the rug where he'd spilled grape juice. The official search ended long ago, the case growing cold, another file in a police station drawer. But a grandparent's search never ends. Not really. It just changes form, becoming a quiet, internal quest, a constant scanning of faces in crowds, a flicker of hope with every ringing phone, a desperate prayer whispered into the empty air each night. My days were quiet now. My husband passed away years before Ethan, so the silence in my home was doubly profound. I spent hours in my garden, a place of solace and quiet reflection. The flowers didn't judge, they just grew, following the rhythm of the seasons. A stark contrast to the frozen, stagnant place my heart often felt trapped in. I avoided the county fair, avoided crowded places in general. The laughter of children, the sight of a red balloon floating in the sky, they were all sharp, painful reminders of what was lost. One afternoon, late spring, I was at the local bookstore, browsed the gardening section. It was a small, cozy place, filled with the comforting smell of paper and ink. I was reaching for a book on roses when a young man beside me did the same. Our hands brushed. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said, pulling his hand back quickly. "No, please, go ahead," I said, offering a small smile. I wasn't paying attention. He smiled back, and for a moment, the world stopped. His eyes, they were the color of a summer sky, just like Ethan's, and his smile. There was something about the tilt of his head, the crinkle at the corner of his eyes, that sent a jolt through me. A flicker of recognition so strong it made me feel dizzy. He was young, in his early 20s, with sandy brown hair that fell across his forehead. He wasn't a mirror image of Ethan, not exactly. People change as they grow. But the resemblance, the eyes, the smile, it was uncanny. "Thank you," he said, picking up the book. "It looks like a good one." His voice was polite, unfamiliar. "It is," I managed to say, my voice a little breathless. My mind was racing. It couldn't be. It couldn't possibly be him. Ethan would be 23 now. This young man was younger. But sometimes trauma, stress, it could affect growth, appearance. And the eyes were exactly the same. "Are you a keen gardener?" he asked, making polite conversation. "Yes," I replied, trying to focus. "I find it grounding." He nodded. "I'm just starting out. My grandmother always had the most beautiful garden. Roses were her favorite." My heart leaped into my throat. His grandmother. Roses. "Oh," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's lovely. Roses are special." "She passed away a few years ago," he continued, a touch of sadness in his voice. "I'm trying to keep her garden going as a way to feel close to her." "That's a wonderful tribute," I said, my mind spinning. Could it be? Could his grandmother have? Could there be a connection? We talked for a few more minutes about gardening, about roses. I learned his name was Liam. He was new to the area, just moved here for work. He seemed like a kind, gentle young man. All the while, my eyes kept returning to his, searching for something, anything, that might confirm the impossible hope flickering to life within me. As we parted ways, I hesitated for a moment, wanting desperately to ask him more, to somehow probe for a connection, but fear held me back. What if it was just a coincidence, a cruel trick of light and resemblance? I didn't want to appear like a confused, grieving old woman clinging to false hope. "It was nice meeting you, Liam," I said, finally. "You too," he replied, with that familiar, unfamiliar smile. "Maybe I'll see you around." I watched him walk away, my heart pounding. Liam, summer sky eyes, sandy brown hair, a grandmother who loved roses. It was too many coincidences. Or maybe it wasn't a coincidence at all. Maybe it was something more, something that felt like fate. Chapter 2. The encounter with Liam at the bookstore haunted me. The uncanny resemblance, the mention of his grandmother and roses, it felt like a sign, a breadcrumb left on a path I had long given up walking. The quiet despair I had lived with for 15 years was suddenly pierced by a fragile, terrifying hope. Could Liam somehow be connected to Ethan? Could he be Ethan? I knew it was unlikely. The age didn't seem quite right, but I couldn't dismiss the feeling his eyes had stirred in me, that deep, intuitive recognition that transcended logic. I spent the next few days in a turmoil of emotion. I pulled out old photos of Ethan, comparing them to the fleeting image of Liam etched in my memory. The resemblance was there, undeniably, especially in the eyes and the smile. But 15 years is a long time. People change. I thought about reaching out to Detective Miller, the kind, persistent detective who had handled Ethan's case all those years ago. But what would I say? "Detective, I met a young man with eyes like my grandson's and a grandmother who liked roses. Could he be him?" It sounded like the ramblings of a woman lost in grief. I decided I needed to try and find out more about Liam on my own, cautiously, without alarming him or raising false hope. I knew his first name, Liam, and that he was new to the area for work. It wasn't much, but in a small town, sometimes that's enough. I started asking subtle questions around town. At the local coffee shop, the grocery store, places where gossip and information often flowed freely. I described a young man who had recently moved here, Working in some kind of office job, maybe? I was vague, hoping someone might know who I was talking about. It took a few days, but eventually the owner of the hardware store, a friendly woman named Carol, mentioned a young man who fit the description. "Oh, you must mean Liam," she said. "Nice young fellow. Just moved into that little cottage on Elm Street. The one with the overgrown rose garden. Works down at the new tech company by the highway. Elm Street. The cottage with the overgrown rose garden." My heart skipped a beat. This was getting more and more specific. I knew the cottage on Elm Street. It had been empty for a few years. It belonged to the old Henderson family. I decided to take a drive down Elm Street. It felt like a transgression, peering into someone's life like this. But the pull of curiosity, the desperate need to know, was too strong to resist. The cottage was small and charming, a little dilapidated, but with undeniable potential. And in the front yard, overgrown and tangled, was indeed a rose garden, filled with neglected bushes heavy with blooms. As I drove slowly past, I saw a car in the driveway. A dark sedan I didn't recognize. Liam's car, presumably. I didn't see Liam himself, but I felt a strange sense of connection to the place, to the neglected roses, to the young man who was trying to keep his grandmother's memory alive. The next step felt overwhelming. How could I possibly learn more about Liam's history, his family, without being intrusive? I thought about trying to find him online, on social media, but I didn't know his last name, and searching for Liam was futile. Then I remembered something else Carol at the hardware store had said. He just moved here for work at the new tech company. The new tech company. That was a concrete detail. I didn't know anything about technology, but I knew how to make a phone call. I found the number for the tech company and called their main line. I asked to speak to someone in human resources. When I finally got through to someone, I felt nervous and unsure of what to say. I decided on a slightly circuitous approach. I explained that I was a long-time resident, interested in welcoming new people to the community, and that I had met a young man named Liam, who mentioned he worked there. I wondered if they could possibly pass along my contact information, just to say hello and offer any help he might need settling in. It was a flimsy excuse, but the HR representative was kind and said she would forward my request to him. I didn't expect anything to come of it. To my surprise, Liam called me that evening. "Hello, Mrs.," he said, his voice a little hesitant. "It's Martha," I said quickly, "from the bookstore." "Oh, Martha." His voice brightened. "Thank you for calling. That was very kind of you. I got your message from work." "I hope I wasn't being too forward," I said. I remembered our conversation, and you seemed new to the area, and I know how difficult it can be to settle in." "Not at all," he said genuinely. It was really thoughtful. "It is a bit strange being in a new town where you don't know anyone." We talked for a while longer. I learned a little more about him. He had grown up in a different state, came here for a job opportunity. He talked about his grandmother again, about how close they were, how he missed her. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to take a leap of faith. "Liam," I said softly, "forgive me for asking, but you mentioned your grandmother loved roses. Did she have a particular type she was fond of?" There was a slight pause. "Yes," he said. "She had this one type, climbing roses, a really vibrant red. She called them Ethan's Flame." My breath hitched. Ethan's Flame. It was a name I had given to a particularly bright red climbing rose I had in my own garden. A rose that Ethan had loved because he said it was the color of a superhero's cape. I had never heard anyone else use that name. Ethan's flame, I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. Yes, he said, sounding a little surprised. Do you know them? Yes, I said, tears blurring my vision. I do. I have them in my garden. The coincidence was too profound to ignore. Ethan's flame, a private name for a specific rose known only to me and my lost grandson. And now, this young man, who resembled him so strikingly, whose grandmother loved roses, used the same name, Liam. I said, my voice shaking, there's something I need to tell you. Something extraordinary. Chapter 3. Telling Liam about Ethan was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I invited him to my house, sitting him down in my living room, surrounded by photos of the grandson whose eyes he shared. I started by telling him about Ethan, about the fair, about the day he disappeared. I showed him pictures of Ethan at different ages, pointing out the sandy hair, the summer sky eyes, the gap-toothed smile that faded as he grew. Liam listened with quiet attentiveness, his expression shifting from polite interest to a deep, unsettling seriousness. He looked at the photos of Ethan, and then back at me, a question growing in his eyes. And the roses? I said, my voice trembling. My Ethan loved my red climbing roses. He said they looked like a superhero's cape. I started calling them Ethan's flame. It was just our name for them. No one else knew. Ethan's flame, he repeated softly, the name now charged with a new, profound meaning. When you said your grandmother called her red climbing roses that name, I paused, struggling to find the words. It's not a common name for a rose, Liam. It was our secret name. And your eyes, your smile, you look so much like him. I saw the dawning realization in his eyes. He was starting to understand what I was suggesting, the incredible, almost impossible possibility that was unfolding between us. You think I could be Ethan? He asked, his voice barely audible. I don't know, I said, tears streaming down my face. My heart is telling me there's a connection, Liam. The resemblance, the roses, it feels like destiny. But my head knows how unlikely it is. But I had to tell you, I had to explore this. He was quiet for a long time, looking at the photos, then around my living room, his gaze lingering on the small, everyday objects that were infused with memories of a little boy. My grandmother, she raised me, he said finally. My parents, they weren't really in the picture. I lived with her since I was very young. She never talked much about my early childhood. She always said it was a difficult time before I came to live with her. Where did you live before? I asked, my breath held tight in my chest. I don't really remember, he admitted. Just flashes, a lot of noise, being scared, and a woman, a kind woman, I think. But it's all very blurry, like a dream. Do you remember your grandmother having red climbing roses when you were little? I asked. He frowned in concentration. I think so, he said slowly. Yes, I think she did. In the garden of the house we lived in before the cottage. She always fussed over them. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture that was both miraculous and terrifying. Could his difficult time before living with his grandmother have been the time he was missing? Could the kind woman he vaguely remembered have been a stranger who took him? And how did he end up with a grandmother who called her roses Ethan's flame? "Liam," I said, my voice gentle, "would you be willing to do a DNA test? Just to see if there's a family connection?" He looked at me, his summer sky eyes filled with a mixture of confusion, fear, and a growing curiosity. He was grappling with the possibility that his entire identity, his life story, might be different from what he believed. "Yes," he said, his voice firming. "Yes, I think I would. I need to know, Martha. I need to know what this means." We ordered a DNA kit that day. The wait was agonizing, filled with a fragile hope that warred with years of ingrained despair. I didn't tell Sarah yet. I couldn't, not until I had something more concrete, something that wouldn't just reopen her wound without the promise of healing. Liam and I spent time together while we waited for the results. We talked, shared stories, cautiously building a connection that felt both new and deeply familiar. He told me more about his grandmother, the woman who raised him with love and stability. He showed me pictures of her. She was a kind-faced woman, her eyes holding a hint of sadness. We talked about the time he came to live with her. It was sudden, he said. He was very young. His grandmother seemed stressed, worried. She rarely spoke about the circumstances, only saying that he was safe now, that he was home. The more we talked, the more coincidences emerged. He had a small scar above his left eyebrow, the result of falling off his bicycle when he was 7. Ethan had a similar scar in the same place. He had a distinctive birthmark on his ankle, shaped like a tiny star. Ethan had a birthmark there too. Each discovery felt like another piece of evidence, another sign that the impossible might be true. The day the DNA results came back, I was terrified to open the email. I called Liam and we agreed to look at them together. We sat side by side, clicking the link, the screen loading slowly, every second stretching into an eternity. The results appeared. Under genetic matches, at the very top of the list, under immediate family, was my name, Martha Davis, estimated relationship, grandmother. And next to it, the name of my late daughter, Sarah, listed as mother. Liam was Ethan. My lost grandson was found. Chapter 4. The moment of confirmation was overwhelming. Tears streamed down my face. Tears of relief, joy, and the bittersweet ache of 15 years of loss. Liam, my quiet, pined young man, was my Ethan, grown up, here with me. He was stunned, silent at first. Then his own eyes filled with tears. The life he thought he knew, the identity he had carried for 23 years, was suddenly different, expanded, connected to a past he had only dimly remembered. "Ethan," I whispered, reaching out to take his hand. His hand was larger now, a man's hand, but the warmth of his touch was familiar, a connection that transcended time. "Martha," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Grandma Martha." It was like the universe had corrected itself, bringing together two souls who had been tragically separated. The next step was telling Sarah. It was a conversation filled with trepidation. How do you tell a mother that the child she has grieved for, the child she believed was lost forever, is alive and standing here? I called her, my voice trembling as I asked her to come over. When she arrived, her face was etched with worry. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Sarah," I said, taking her hands, "I have something. Something incredible to tell you, something that's going to change everything." I introduced her to Liam, explaining how I met him, the resemblance, the coincidences, the DNA test. As I spoke, Sarah's eyes went from confusion to disbelief to a dawning, fragile hope. She looked at Liam, truly looked at him, seeing not just a stranger, but the echoes of the little boy she had lost. When I told her about the DNA results, confirming that Liam was her son, her Ethan, she gasped, then crumpled into sobs, clinging to Liam, burying her face in his chest. "Ethan," she cried, her voice a broken whisper. "My baby, you're alive." It was a moment of profound, cathartic release. 15 years of pent-up grief and longing finally finding their outlet. Liam, gentle and steady, held his birth mother, absorbing her tears, her pain, her overwhelming love. There were so many questions. Where had he been? Who was the grandmother who raised him? How did he end up with her? Liam, now Ethan again, shared what he knew, piecing together the fragments of his early memories with the information we now had. He remembered being with a woman, a kind woman, after the fair. He remembered being in different places. He remembered being scared and confused. Then he remembered going to live with his grandmother. She had been kind, loving, his constant, in a world that had been turned upside down. We started trying to piece together the story from his grandmother's side. Who was she? How did she come to have Ethan? Was she the woman who took him from the fair? Through legal channels and the help of Detective Miller, who reopened Ethan's case with a renewed sense of purpose, we began to uncover the truth. Ethan's grandmother, Eleanor Vance, had a daughter who had tragically died years earlier. That daughter had a child, a little boy who was roughly Ethan's age. But that child had been in the custody of his father, who was neglectful and unstable. Eleanor had been trying desperately to gain custody of her grandson. But the legal battles were long and difficult. On the day Ethan disappeared, Eleanor Vance was at the county fair, coincidentally trying to find her daughter's former partner to serve him with legal papers related to custody. She saw Ethan, alone for a moment, and in her grief and desperation, she mistook him for her own grandson. The resemblance must have been striking, fueled by her longing and sorrow. It wasn't a malicious abduction in the way we had feared. It was a tragic case of mistaken identity, born out of grief and desperation. Eleanor Vance, seeing the opportunity, took Ethan, believing he was her own grandson, taking him to safety, as she saw it, away from the chaotic environment she believed him to be in. She had raised him as her own, given him a stable, loving home, protecting him from the outside world, from anyone who might discover the truth. She had changed his name, created a new identity for him, all out of a twisted sense of love and a desperate need to fill the void left by her own lost family. The red roses, Ethan's flame, were a heartbreaking echo of this confusion. A name she might have heard Ethan say, or perhaps a name she had given to her own lost grandson's favorite flower, transferring it on to the child she took. Eleanor Vance had passed away a few years before I met Liam. The truth, hidden for so long, had remained buried with her. Chapter 5. The truth about how Ethan was lost was complex and deeply sad. It wasn't the act of a monster, but the desperate choice of a grieving woman lost in her own pain and delusion. Understanding the circumstances, the tragedy of Eleanor Vance's own life, brought a strange sense of peace, a shifting from anger and fear to a more nuanced understanding of the human capacity for both love and profound mistakes. Ethan's return brought immense joy, but it also presented challenges. He had lived a life as Liam, built relationships, formed memories that were separate from us. His bond with Eleanor Vance, the woman who raised him, was real and deep. He loved her, despite the deception. We had to navigate this new reality with care and compassion. Sarah and I welcomed Ethan back into our lives with open hearts, but we also respected the life he had lived, the person he had become. We spent time together, sharing stories, rebuilding connections that had been severed for 15 years. Ethan had to process the truth about his origins, the fact that the woman who raised him was not his biological grandmother, that his life had started with a moment of loss and mistaken identity. It was a lot to absorb, a challenging journey of reconciling his past with his present. His birth father, Mark, was also brought into the fold. He was stunned and overwhelmed by the news, but ultimately filled with immense relief and a deep desire to reconnect with the son he thought he had lost forever. The years of pain and separation between Sarah and Mark didn't magically disappear, but the shared miracle of Ethan's return offered a pathway towards healing and a new form of family connection. Ethan, the young man who had walked into my life in a bookstore with eyes the color of a summer sky and a name for a rose that unlocked a hidden past, became the bridge that brought our fractured family back together. His presence filled the silent spaces in our lives, bringing back laughter, hope, and a sense of wholeness we thought was gone forever. We learned about the life Ethan had lived with Eleanor Vance. It was a quiet life, filled with her love for him, her dedication to his well-being. Despite the deceptive foundation, she had provided him with stability and care. It was a complex legacy, a reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, threads of love can be woven into the fabric of a life. Ethan continued to honor the memory of Eleanor Vance, the woman who raised him. He kept the cottage on Elm Street, tending the rose garden, including the climbing red roses she called Ethan's flame. It was a way for him to integrate the two parts of his life, the past and the present, the woman who raised him and the family he was born into. The scar above his eyebrow, the star-shaped birthmark, they were no longer just physical traits, but markers of a journey, visible reminders of the little boy who was lost and the young man who was found. My garden, once a place of solitary grief, became a place of shared joy. Ethan helped me with the roses, talking about his grandmother's techniques, his face relaxed and happy. Sarah joined us sometimes, her laughter lighter than it had been in 15 years. The county fair came and went each year, but the fear and pain it once evoked had lessened, replaced by a quiet gratitude for the miracle that had brought Ethan back to us. The red balloon, once a symbol of loss, became a poignant reminder of the day that changed everything. The day a little boy disappeared, only to be found years later. A young man carrying the echoes of his past in his eyes and in the name of a rose. The journey of grief doesn't end, but it transforms. The sharp edges soften, the heavy weight lightens. Ethan's return didn't erase the 15 years of pain, but it infused them with meaning, with a sense of destiny, of a life returned. The echo in his eyes was no longer just a haunting resemblance, but the reflection of a shared history, a rediscovered love, and the enduring power of family bonds, strong enough to span the years and bridge the divides created by loss and secret choices. My grandson was home, and the silence in my heart was finally filled with the sound of his laughter, the most beautiful sound in the world.